Hi everyone, my name is Charlotte and today I'm going to show you how to stitch a bucket hat together. If you haven't watched it yet, do please watch my 2 other tutorials on how to draft your own bucket or summer hat to any size. And I have one tutorial for a basic one, which is quite square, and then I've got a tutorial on how you can adapt your basic hat to do a slightly more sophisticated vintage inspired style. But once you got your pattern, now it's time to put it all together. So the first thing you need to think is about fabrics. You want to have quite a stable fabric, nothing too thin. If you've fallen in love with a chiffon and want to have a chiffon hat, you need to interface it. I'm being sensible. I'm making it out of a waterproof cotton. So it's rubberized on the inside, but it looks like a cotton from the outside, and it also means it's a nice stable fabric. You want something stable to work with because we're working with lots of curves and zero ease. You can't do any easing in this style. It's about very precise stitching together. So you want to make things easy for you by choosing a suitable fabric which isn't too stretchy or drapey. Nice and stable, or even stiff if possible. And the best thing is to have a look at what these hats are made out of in shops. It's mostly like nice cottons, stiff cottons. You can make it out of a single layer if you're doing it in a canvas or something. I'm going to line mine fully, and I'm using a cotton to line. So I could line in the same fabric, but I think it'd be too heavy. So I'm lining it in a slightly thinner sort of quilt, like what you use for quilting as well. I think it's Japanese. Japanese cotton, which matches quite well. Of course, you can do contrast, you can do whatever you want to, it's up to you. What I'm going to do, this is quite a soft cotton, so I'm going to interface it with the iron-on interfacing. I'm using quite a thin but stiff one, so try to get the stiffest but thinnest ones you can get. And so I'm going to have 3 layers in the hat: the outer, the interfacing, and then the inner. So before we stitch all together, you need to cut out your top once in each fabric and the interlining. Then the sides, I'm having a front and a back, so I'm going to cut out a pair in each. And with the rim again, I'm having a front and back, but of course you might have one rim, but I need to cut out a pair in each fabric again. Once you've done that, let's stitch it all together. Here are my pattern pieces all fused together. A quick note, I've used 1 centimeter seam allowance everywhere just because I'm very comfortable with that. If you saw lots of curves, or can make it easier if you actually use the edge of your foot as the edge of your seam allowance. So in my case, I will make my seam allowance 0.7 centimeters wide. So you can change it. You can make things a bit easier because, of course, the wider your seam allowance is, the more extreme your curves become. So, you know, if I have a 2 centimeter seam allowance, it's going to be really hard to match that to this. So definitely the maximum I would use is 1 centimeter, and you can go even lower to make it easier to stitch. But that's just a little aside. And do have a practice run if you haven't done any curves before. Then the first thing we need to do is just stitch our the sides together. So you just stitch 1 centimeter in. That's a completely straight seam, so that should be straightforward. And the same again. And my cat is absolutely horrible. I don't like my cats near my work, but I need to. They've laid on it, so I need to clean it in a second. But you stitch along here as well, and then again with the rim you stitch here half moon shapes together, and they're all straight seams, so we're starting super easy. You can see they're actually less than a half moon now, but yeah, just stitch them all together. Normal length stitch, straightforward. I'm not gonna do zigzags or overlock because everything will be hidden in the end. So just straightforward stitching. When you're stitching all your straight lines, one thing to consider is, because I'm going to construct the whole inner head out of lining, and the whole outer head out of my waterproof fabric. And then in the end, I'm gonna turn it inside out. I'm gonna stitch it together along the rim, and then I'm gonna turn it inside out. So what you would call the Dorito method, or I call bagging out. So what I actually done with one seam from the lining fabric, I actually left a gap, and it's back stitched on both sides, but I have an opening there, and I'm gonna use that to turn my head inside out later on. That way you have 0 visible seams. This might be a bit small. We will find out when we try to turn it inside out. That's all my straight seams done. So we started easy. Now it's gonna get a little bit trickier, but if you take it slowly, it should be straightforward. At this step, you can give your seams a nice press, and you can either press them open or to one side. If you press it to one side, just make sure the other layer is pressed to the other side. And I like to press them to one side because that gives like a stronger finish, I feel, because that way none of your stitching is exposed. If you press your seam allowance to either side, you actually got only the stitch line holding everything together. So I think this will become a little bit more stable that way, and maybe a little bit more waterproof, but I'm not holding my breath. I have added lots of notches, and notches are the little markings you add to make sure you can line up your pattern pieces. And I like to snip them, but you can also mark them with a thread line or a pen or whatever you prefer to do. You can see I've actually added a 8 notches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So for each 8th of the circle, and then they're gonna transfer to here. So again, it's halfway, and then the 8th, and then again to my rim as well. I've got 8 odd notches overall. So that will help me line it up, because with some people, when they're putting curves together, like to use lots and lots of pins, literally every centimeter. I find that too tricky to hold it together. I like to do a little bit at a time, so that way I know I have to match the 2 curves rather than the pins sort of distorting the curves, because I want really nice smooth lines. And I always find if I have too many pins, you either have to take them out constantly, which means you're stopping constantly, which means you don't get a very smooth stitch line. So I like to sort of do this amount, like 8, which means the bits of curve I have to put together is actually not that much. And if you're really struggling, you can always, what you can do is the shorter curve, which in this case is the side, you can snip into it a bit. So at the moment you can see this is more pronounced, the curve, because the seam allowance is added to a curve, while this is nearly a straight line. So I need to make sure they match. So it can be quite tricky. You can see if you aren't careful, you get wrinkles. So what you can do very carefully is basically what we normally do after stitching. But you don't do it too close to your seam. I sort of do it 3/4 in. And by snipping it open, it makes it a bit easier to match it up. Can you see? Now I can match it up really nicely and just stitch it like that. And there's 2 trains of thought. I always think it's some part of it is like personal preference, but I like to always have the shorter curves, in which case this one, on the top, and then I can force that open onto the bigger curve. But some people like to have a shorter one on the bottom and then ease in the longer curve, but that's up to you. But I'm going to now stitch my whole top to my sides, and then I'm going to do exactly the same, pinning and snipping if necessary to my rim. So stitch it all along, and I'm probably going to line up my 2 seams more or less. I might sort of, yeah, I'm going to line it up and see how it goes, because it isn't that bulky. And then I'm going to do exactly the same with the outer fabric. And once I've done that, I'm going to show you the last step to putting it all together. Now I have two separate bucket hats and I just need to stitch them together. So right side to right side, and then all you do is stitch the rim together. There's only one thing to consider, and that's to make sure your seams are in the same place if you have them. So I'm actually not overlap matching up completely. I'm moving them probably about 1 centimeter apart, and that way I'm avoiding any bulk but making sure the seams are in the same place, so you don't suddenly have a seam here and then a seam here on two different sides, which is really annoying. But that's all you have to do, just stitch all the way around. Either do your normal seam allowance and then trim and snip, or I'm doing a slightly narrower seam allowance, so I'm doing the seam allowance the same width as my foot. And here we have it, the inside out hat, like an Easter egg, ready to be turned out. The last thing I would actually do is, if you can, very carefully press it open a bit. It's going to be tricky, so you can either do it, do like a pre-press on the inside, or press it fully when you turn it inside out. And to do it, you just open the side of your hat, but you still have a gap, and just start turning it inside out. And of course afterwards you can just hand stitch that opening together, or with a lot of commercial hats they machine stitch it very carefully as well. And then you end up with a proper sided Easter egg, or slightly abstract shape, and you just start putting it together and you end up with your summer hat or rain hat, or bucket hat, whatever you want to call it. Slightly more sophisticated in shape. What I love about this is at the moment it has no visible seams, and I quite like the simplicity and sophistication of having no top stitching. You need to of course iron it very carefully, but then in theory, once you did a little bit of stitching together on your lining, you have a fully reversible summer hat. And I can even put my hair in. But you can see with a bit of an iron or breath, it's going to look really nice. And then of course, if you like this sort of more, I'll call it sporty, it's not sporty, but if you like the top stitching line, you can of course add that. It looks beautiful in a proper top stitching thread, so quite a chunky thread, and I quite like for summer contrast white lines. And you normally put one stitch line around the edge. Quite often you put a stitch line here, which will also hold it in place, because you don't, depending on the fabric you use, this sits quite well, but sometimes they can sort of move a bit. So what you can also do is do some hand stitching, just holding the edges together so they don't suddenly, you end up with a head which is like wonky, which ends up being that. You don't want that. So it's quite a good idea to just do like a slip stitch joining the two together, but then you can actually highlight all the seams and really nice top stitching if you want to. That's of course up to you. And another method of course is to do rows of top stitching all along the rim, which gives you more strength, like you do on baseball caps as well. If you decide to do that, then you will have to construct that separately, because that needs to be super precise, otherwise it just looks wonky. So you can't do the bagging out method. You will have to do the rim separately and then join your rim to the hat at the end. But that's a great thing about drafting and making your own. You have so many possibilities to make it exactly your own in any fabric you want. So I hope you enjoyed this little series on how to make a basic and a more constructed summer or fabric or bucket hat, and how to actually put it all together. If you ever see something you'd like me to look at, do please send me a message on Instagram. Otherwise, I'd love a thumbs up from you, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video from me. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and enjoy making your bucket hat.